Hello, welcome to Cinema Savvy. We have reached the 8th film in the James Bond Retrospective series with a 1973 film, Live and Let Die, directed once again by Guy Hamilton. Last week, we said goodbye to Sean Connery's incarnation of Bond. Some might say, thank God, after Diamonds Are Forever. Go and check out our review on that one. That was a really fun one, despite not being one of the best Bond films, I think we can say. And today we're in it for the long haul with this thing. We're going all the way through this series. It is a retrospective, of course, and we're starting with Roger Moore today, his first outing as Bond. And he's going to be here for a few weeks' time. So let's hope that you're a Roger Moore fan. And if not, I'm very, very sorry. But this one's a very interesting one because I think pretty much all three of us remembered this film very differently from how we have now processed it on a rewatch. I can definitely say that for myself. If anyone's been following this series before, you know that I've been hyping this up and Man with the Golden Gun. We're going to get into this one. I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Obviously, this is going to be completely spoiler-filled. We're going to go into behind the scenes, especially Roger Moore, which I think is going to be a big discussion for tonight. The villains, the Bond girls, everything. You know the score by now if you've been following us for all these weeks. But before we do, over to George with the socials.
Absolutely, guys. This one's been out for a while, so obviously we're going to talk about the whole thing properly. It's been just under 50 years now. And this is one of the, I think, before you watch this film, like as a kid, I think you'd at least recognize the imagery, certainly of Baron Samedi more than anything. And it was one of the films that has that iconography, I guess, within itself, let alone the Moore stuff and all the other things. It's one of the most visually standout Bond films. But we want to know your thoughts on this film. So comment along with us if you're watching live. If you're not watching live, do hit us a comment. We'll reply to those. We'll go through all of them. We'll get them sorted. And if you're new to the channel, if you think, why are they talking about old James Bond films? It's because we're going to be reviewing all of them. We are, as we said, we're starting the Roger Moore era. There are 7. That means we are 9 films away from Pierce Brosnan. That's how I'm treating the next 7 weeks. Leaving that little wink there about my sort of basic thoughts on this James Bond, I'm going to tell us where to find us on social medias to voice your dispute, which is Facebook at Cinema Savvy, Twitter at Cinema_Savvy, letterboxd.com/Cinema Savvy, and we have a link to the TeePublic store in the description below. But nope, we are obviously talking Live and Let Die, and it's really hard not to linger on the die, but I am not Paul McCartney, therefore I shall not do it. And I'm going to hand over to Tate as usual to give your sort of, I guess, thoughts on the sort of the basic. What would you even say the premise? Like, I don't even know where you start.
Premise. I mean, yeah. IMDb says James Bond is sent to stop a diabolically brilliant heroin magnate armed with a complex organization and a reliable psychic tarot card reader. Which, when you hear it, just sounds like a bunch of gibberish, right? Like the concept.
Name me a Bond film that isn't though, Tate. Come on, like, you know what you're in for at this point.
I mean, you already said it, Chris. Like, we all had very different memories of this film growing up, and kind of different memories, at least to now on rewatch. I had very fond memories of this film growing up. I remember this film being very fun. Like George said, it's an iconic images that come from this film. This film is just like shot after shot of just iconography and everything like that. That is to do with the Roger Moore era, just Bond in general. We'll move on to kind of thoughts now, because I will say it's a little bit different. I didn't hold this film as highly as I did the first time kind of watching it as a kid, as I did rewatching it for this kind of series. I'm trying to still put my finger on what it is in particular, but I don't have as fond a memory of the film anymore, shall we say.
No, I think what it is with me is that, and actually Richard Maybaum said this too, who was obviously one of the long-running screenwriters of the James Bond films, who didn't write this film. He's later gone on to say that he didn't like this film because, and this is a quote, "to process drugs in the middle of the jungle is not a Bond caper." And I think that's what I was kind of hit with while watching this as well. Very similar to Diamonds Are Forever, and obviously the carryover here is Tom Mankiewicz, the writer, in that it just, you know, we said James Bond going off to stop a diamond heist or whatever, or stealing diamonds you wouldn't send James Bond out to do that, let alone with this film, like a drug baron, sending out 3 previous agents to stop this guy and all of them getting killed and sending James Bond out to do it. I guess if like all the agents are getting killed at the beginning of the film, then you probably send in your best guy, but it's the premise is just stupid. And like we're going to go into like the behind the scenes of this and where it all came about. This was actually an idea posed by Mankiewicz, who I think you got to look at what was going on at the time as well. What we're in 73 with this one. You had like the Black Panthers and you had other kind of like political and racial unrest going on at the time. And he thought it would be a good idea to have black villains and kind of go into more of like the cultural stuff and have that be the backdrop for this film. We'll go into culture later on, because I know that certainly one of the actors had a big problem with the script for this thing and how a lot of the stereotypes were handled, and it isn't great. But I've got to be honest, I do like the backdrop of this film. It feels very different. I agree that it probably doesn't feel at home in like a James Bond film, like the whole blaxploitation thing, which is all over this film, like the villains, the soundtrack, the tropes of this film, it's everywhere. But I really like that genre of film. So I actually didn't remember this film being that like steeped in that kind of stylized blaxploitation style. So that was kind of fun going back to this thing, but it's not as good as I remember it. And I'm hopefully by the end of this discussion, we'll all put our finger on why that is. Because it's got some great elements, you know, which we're going to discuss through. It's got a great Bond theme. Roger Moore's fantastic. I really like Roger Moore. We'll go into him in just a second. And I think this is like a fine, you know, first entry for him. But maybe it is the tone. I don't know. But I still, it feels unique within the Bond library is what I think I'm trying to get at. It was made purely just with what was going on politically in the world at the moment. And I guess that is a thing that you do see cultural impact in the James Bond film as they progress through the decades. But maybe that is kind of its own downfall as well. It's probably the writing, I think, mostly what it all comes down to.
Yeah, I think the big thing for this is how important the context is. In sort of 1973, we always say the Bond films, you know, you look at each decade, you get the Russians, you get a bit of blaxploitation. In the 80s, we get things getting a bit more serious. 90s, we're getting technology coming into it. And then the sort of Craig era has been like trying to reset it in that modern world. And it's always a fascinating commentary on what's going on in the world. And I don't think anything can be as sort of, I think, it's not the fact it's being a blaxploitation film and then slap bang poshing this white man in the middle of it. That James Bond. I think that's what makes it be that jump, is that we're just going to chuck Roger Moore in here, which isn't necessarily a criticism of it at the moment. But I think because if you look at the previous entries, right, who's been the big bad from number one? Blofeld. Even to Diamonds Are Forever, yes, we got Goldfinger and we didn't get him and whatnot, but very much he's been this lingering shadow. And this is one of, I guess, the few films before where we're finally getting out of that. We're not going to have a Spectre time. We're going to have something new, something different. We're going to move away from the world domination. And instead it's like, here's black exploitation, and it's about drugs, corrupt dictators. And in his spare time, he's a pimp called Mr. Big. So it's one of them where, you know, obviously it's harder for me to give insight as someone that A, wasn't obviously around in that era, B, it's also white. So it's harder for me to, I think, have a natural opinion on it, because I'd watch some of it saying like, because I know that with black exploitation, it's very hit and miss. And I'm kind of that I don't have the right opinion, I think, to commentate on, I think, what works and what doesn't. But some of it definitely doesn't work on a modern lens. I think that's a fair way to put it. You know, that many of the old Bond films have many issues, more so the treatment of the Bond girls and whatnot. And I think this one, I don't really know. I don't want to say they're cashing in on that genre, but they kind of are. But
they are.
It's the fact. It's the fact. It just riddles down to being about like a drug bust, and you're there like I'm intrigued by this corrupt dictator dynamic and his weird voodoo clan and all this and the Solitaire stuff, and then it's like, but free drugs for America. I'm like, okay. And I think that's where I get lost. It's in that scene on the farm when they just give so much exposition. And I'm just sat there saying, please, James Bond, just do something, kill someone, spy on someone, save the world again, please. It's so not James Bond. And I know obviously Dalton, one of the Dalton films does it, and we do get little bits of it over the years, but it just feels, I think it is very much throwing James Bond in a genre where James Bond shouldn't be anywhere near. It'd be like, I don't know, like, that's a terrible example, but like, not like put James Bond in as this, but it's like, what's so contextually of that time, of that importance? It's like, here's James Bond. And it's like, how? But okay. That's how I feel of this film. It was just like, they're just going to do it, and they did it. And I'm going to pass over because I'm looking.
Yeah. I think you mentioned the stakes there. And the stakes in this film, you want Bond to go and save the world, or you want him to do spy work. Like, that has been the formula for all of the films before then. This film doesn't really do either of those two things. He doesn't really save the world, and he doesn't do much spy work in this film. It's a very unusual mix, and there's a lot of kind of... The film tries to blend a lot of things together. through kind of director Guy Hamilton, who'd worked on, we've already said, some of the best Bond films, but also some weaker Bond films to go along with that. And Tom Mankiewicz, who he's come in from the previous film, and he was brought in with the American angle and trying to Americanize the film and make the film more appealing to the American audiences and stuff like that. You see that in this film. They go to America in this film. There's a lot of Americanisms. There's a character who is introduced in this film who we'll talk about later, who is, wow, the most American character you could easily put on film. But it's another one of those films where, from a writing perspective, writing the Bond character and stuff like that, and what goes around with the film, is trying to get that American audience in. And I don't know if that's coming from us three who are English, British, who know Bond as being this kind of English super spy. Would love to see the Englishisms and stuff like that goes with it, kind of the drinking tea and kind of for the Queen of England and everything like that Bond is. This film kind of goes in that more, well, he does American stuff as well, guys. Hey, look, he can get along with you guys and stuff like that. And I just don't know whether it just clicks with this writer and whether that is the problem with the film.
I think it is, and there is like a sort of inherent campy tone that you get with Mankiewicz, I think, as a writer. Definitely a lot more in Diamonds Are Forever compared to this one. I'd say he keeps it restrained right up until that character is introduced, and then it's like, oh, this feels like I'm watching Diamonds Are Forever again. But I'm kind of agreeing with Nikolai here. I'm going to bring up his comment in just a second, but the last movie, you had Blofeld wanting to gather a bunch of diamonds to create a space laser. Where do you go from that? So I actually appreciate this film because it makes it much more street level. And, you could argue that that wasn't part of the plan. That was part of the plan when they saw what was going on in the world and which kind of films were hitting with audiences more. Maybe they wanted to appeal to a different demographic. And, it felt very reactionary to that. But I like that this is a lot more stripped back. It's not like a world-ending megalomaniacal supervillain. It is just a drug lord, which, on the one hand, it is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, that's not a Bond story that's been established in the previous films. It feels very small scale. That would feel like an FBI buddy cop movie kind of drug bust kind of thing. You wouldn't send a British secret agent into a situation like that. But Nikolai's comment right here, the unique themes and atmosphere are actually something I quite appreciate about this film. It is very weird in the context of Bond, but I like weird, and unlike Diamonds Are Forever, it doesn't play it all for laughs. And I think that's where I come down on this film, and I think that's maybe why I had so many fond memories of this film, is that I love the voodoo style of it. I love the style of this film and the locations that it's set in. It feels so very different and kind of like a breath of fresh air. And I think that also comes down, if we're going to move on as well to talk about Roger Moore himself, it feels like a breath of fresh air as a film, but also you are having that new incarnation of Bond who I guess you could kind of say is the sort of like unofficial original Bond, because Roger Moore was touted to play Bond even before Dr. No. I think he was a name that was thrown around when they knew they were going to change Bond before they went with Lazenby. I think his name came up again. Obviously he finally got the gig with this one and I think he's the longest. Is he the longest serving Bond, or is he drawing with Daniel Craig now as of this year?
Film-wise, he's the longest serving Bond, but not year-wise.
Year-wise, okay. But so I guess we can get into Roger Moore now. I think he's absolutely tremendous in this film. I love Roger Moore. Hopefully I'm still saying that by the time we get to A View to a Kill, because I know that all the Bonds do kind of have like a natural drop-off after so many films. He feels much more gentlemanly. I think, in terms of like the gentleman spy, he's definitely more of the gentleman than maybe he is the spy kind of stuff. I think Connery had more of that kind of brutish, sort of like fisticuffs kind of spy angle to him, maybe more so than Roger Moore does. But Roger Moore has a real charm to him in this film. I still believe him as Bond when he has those conversations with Moneypenny, despite being a different actor. I still see him as that same character. There is sort of like a natural continuation there. He's a lot more quippy, and by God, when we get to those puns, there are so many puns in this film. He is that kind of Bond, though. They always wanted him. I think that, I don't know if it was Broccoli specifically or Stoltzman, one of those who wanted him from the beginning. I think he's a tremendous choice. I think this is a good first film for him. I know that we mentioned last week how that film would have been if Moore had been in Diamonds Are Forever as his first film. I don't know, because that film wasn't strong to me, and maybe that would have been kind of a weak entry. But certainly tonally, I would say that Diamonds of Forever feels much more like a Roger Moore Bond film than a Connery one, going back to that one that we did from last week.
No, absolutely. I think one of the really important Bond conversations, and I've said this a couple of times already, and I'm sure it will come up again when we talk about View to a Kill. When a new Bond comes in, normally the last one has got so ridiculous, so over the top, so ridiculous that you need to calm it down. And there's no easier way to calm it down than to bring in the new Bond. And you get this, obviously it's harder with Lazenby because it was one film and out, right? But you could see they completely shifted the tone, shifted the story's dynamic purpose, all of the writing, and made it more mature. Whereas this one was, okay, we're not going to make like the Lazenby film, but we're definitely also not going to make it like the Connery films. It needs to be its own thing. And I think it certainly feels smaller budget. I'm sure it was still a big budget at the time, but sticking to sort of several locations, no world traveling, him here. Yes, we get the trains and the odd thing, but the whole purpose of the Moore stuff, I think, is very much this introduction to Bond, and they're not rubbing it in your face. It's new Bond. Go back to that Lazenby opening scene when you've got the really important build-up, the big reveal, whereas this one, it's just Roger Moore being a gentleman. He's with a girl straight away, and I think it's the perfect instruction for him. I think this film is the right film for him. Smaller stakes means you get to spend more time with him. Not as many action sequences, which means we can get to know him a little bit more. I think all of that does help Roger Moore. And the thing, Roger Moore, I absolutely love him. And I think he's one of the, I don't want to, this sounds horrible, not a few Bonds I like more as a person than as James Bond. I adore him. But in terms of like representing James Bond, I don't think there is anyone of a higher circumstance or ever will be. He is someone that obviously loved the role as he took it on, loved it very much afterwards. In fact, there's a stage named after him at Pinewood. He had an office there until he died. He is someone that has embraced, I don't want to say fandom, but I guess back then it would have been, right? That he was always like a representative for that. It's sort of like a Mark Hamill, right? Even the gaps between 6 and 7 for the real life. Hamill was always there representing Star Wars. And I think Roger Moore has that, whereas you get people like Connery, as much as we love them, he was, they're all tax sales because Roger Moore lived in Monaco, but, very much get me away from Bonds. I'm done with it. Please don't. You get that. Brosnan's always loved it and had an unfortunate ending. Craig, we know, doesn't enjoy it anymore. Crystal Clear doesn't enjoy it anymore. And obviously Dalton just is very, very private. And that's why I think it's such a blessing to come to someone. I know it's outside of the film, but I think that makes a real difference watching where he loves it. And I think you get that in all of his films, even the terrible ones. You know that Roger Moore is having a wonderful time playing him. And I think that really helps. And he's just likable. He is charming, even though he can be a bit creepy, a bit weird. He doesn't feel it. He always feels like he's sort of, what's the word? Sorry, I just read Nicolas' comment. I'm trying not to laugh. But he is one of those, I think, Bonds where I don't see him as a spy. He's a gentleman. But at the same time, being a gentleman has always been a part of being a spy, right? Of all the stereotypes, book stuff, other spy films, that gentlemanly aspect is one of the hardest things to do. And I think Roger Moore just has the natural charisma to do that side of it. And as Nikolai says here, he's very good at the physical scenes in his first few films. Absolutely. I mean, considering he's older than Connery, which is a big thing, people can joke about View to a Kill, that even in this film, he is still older than Sean Connery was, which is mad to think about it. So I think that's a really big thing. But Roger Moore, I think this is one of the perfect films for him. I think by the time you get to Spy Who Loved Me, he's had 2 smaller films, and then it's the big, grandiose, humongous action set piece one. Kind of Craig, I'd say Spectre was that for him. They're all mega rich and expensive, but in terms of what was going to be the big one, it was that one. And I think we get enough time with him in this to settle any doubts that people may have had in the 70s about this man taking over. And I think one of the big things of Roger Moore is that in his previous films, I've not seen any of them, the sort of clips I've seen, he was very, very, not over charismatic, but he had to tone it down for Bond, which is mental when you think about his Bond compared to all the others.
I've seen some of his acting in the TV series The Saint, and that is a very similar character to the Bond that he plays in the films. So I went back through, and I think I was just scrolling through TV and I watched a few episodes of it, and it is very similar to the kind of character that he does play. He does bring across that kind of, that suaveness, that gentlemanness, the charisma, the ability to kind of talk someone's kind of ear off and get the information in that way and stuff like that. So you can see that translating into Bond. It's so weird because I do love Sean Connery as Bond, I've probably seen more of Roger Moore's Bond like through rewatches and repeats of films and stuff like that. I see those two as, for me at least, the Bonds that kind of I watched throughout my childhood and stuff like that. I didn't watch too much of Dalton or even Brosnan kind of growing up and stuff like that. It was these two, and going back and watching the older films, that kind of got me into Bond in the first place. I do actually have to once again go with what Nikolai said and commend the fact that his physicality in this film and the next few films after that was very good, especially given his age. And it's crazy to think now, like, that he was able to kind of do some of the stuff in this film. I know he had stunt people and everything like that. It wasn't all him. But the stunts in this film, they are very, very well done. And if he had any part or hand or part in them, then that's full commendation there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, we mentioned last week as well, when they knew they needed a new Bond after Lazenby, they were going to go with an American actor. I think like Adam West and Burt Reynolds were a couple of the names mentioned there. There's a whole host of different actors. I'm not going to read them all out. If you want to go and check it out, go onto Wikipedia. An American actor, but this, in terms of British actors for this role, there was a whole host of them. And then obviously they went with more. What I like about this film, just going to like a particular moment in the film, is that we open at what I'm assuming is James Bond's house, which I think is the first time that we've seen that in the franchise. I don't know if it's stated that it's his house or if it's just like a place that he's staying at that given moment. But the fact that M comes directly to his house, I don't think we've ever seen anything on that kind of level since the moment where Bond went to M's house on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and they have that kind of heart-to-heart moment there. And there's no sort of like slow reveal to Bond. It's just boom, there you go, there's Roger Moore as Bond. When we had Lazenby, there's that long drawn out intro sequence on the beach leading to the beach sequence where then you get your proper reveal. It's almost like easing, gently dipping your toe back into the realm of Bond with this new actor. And they kind of even do that with Connery as well. We mentioned last week that when you've got a voice as distinctive as Sean Connery, what's the point in delaying the reveal of the character? Just get to it. But they still did that. And they didn't do that with this one. It's just like a very sort of small scale opening. It's not like a mad action scene or anything like that. It's pretty much, you set the stage with what's happening with the like the spies and everything, but the first Bond scene isn't like a big, completely over the top grandiose action scene. It's just him at his home doing what Bond does best, women, right? That's your opening scene.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's what you want from him, and the fact you get Moneypenny in there, you get M as well. There's no formalities. Come to the office, have a chat, get your gadgets, and go. It's very much, the fact the opening doesn't have Bond in the pre-credit sequence. The fact it's setting up the story, and it's very quickly, let's get this into play. Let's get you out on the field working with them. I think that's a really big thing for them to just get the story going, and it is bang on 2 hours. It's not too long. It's not too drawn out like it has been on a few of them. It starts off, I think, in the right place to start pushing you to get into that sort of story dynamic. And I think that's what you need, because I think the other thing, sort of, as we all mentioned, sort of growing up with them, rewatching them and whatnot, obviously, it's the first time you're on a Bond. Yes, you want to kind of build up. But at the same time, this is an iconic character which doesn't actually need a build up. You don't need to have like the back of their head, the side of their head, the legs. Obviously, in 69, yes, you're replacing it for the first time, but I think not only is Moore a great Bond, but the importance of getting it right with the Roger Moore. In fact, they brought in someone that played it 7 times in 12 years. And as the fact there were debates about getting American actors, and you got to think that before Roger Moore, there'd been 2 Bonds. One was Australian, one was Scottish. And I think once you get Roger Moore, that's probably across the next 10 years where they sort of adamantly said, he will always be British. We've had Irish, we've had Welsh, we've had English, we've had Scottish, we've had Australian. I know they're in Eurovision, but it is one of those where I think getting it right, and again, it's that gentleman vibe that I don't mean this to sound racist, and if it means it, I'm going to apologize, but could you get an American in to be that gentlemanly? No, you couldn't. And I think that's where so much of that sort of Kingsman type thing, that aesthetic, everything is on Roger Moore, because Sean Connery is almost the definitive Bond. But Tate, as you said earlier, everyone will, 90% of people are going to say Connery or Moore. And I think because between them, they did 13 films, like that's over half the franchise so far. And the others obviously film changes, production lengths, whatnot. budgets, everything changes. We're never going to get an actor to play Bond 7 times unless they get 22-year-old or something like that. It's just not going to happen in today's day and age. And I think that's what you want with it. You want someone that's long-term, and they planned that with Roger Moore. Yes, it was too long-term and things got too old, but they made sure that didn't become an issue again. And, we can all laugh at Craig now, but at the end of the day, it's been more of a train wreck of production issues, more so than them saying in 2020, Daniel Craig's filming another film to come out next year. Whereas obviously it was more like, he's going to do his last film. It's just been delayed like 2 and a bit years. So it's one of those where I think lessons were learned from up to Live and Let Die, and then Live and Let Die onwards. They're sort of etching the path for what comes next.
Not only that, but it also gave them the ability to have the Roger Moore name blend into the 007 very nicely on all of their posters, just as a thing that they could go ahead with the films they couldn't do with the previous 2 actors.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned about like we wouldn't get an actor now to do like so many films, but I don't know about that. I think it depends on contracts, because going to like superhero films, right? Hugh Jackman as Logan, as Wolverine, so many films, decades, I think, pretty much, that he's played that character. You could even say in some respects, Robert Downey Jr. with Tony Stark, you can get actors that play a character for a long amount of time. So I wouldn't rule it out completely. I do think that the next one that they're looking for will be one that they look to sort of like bunker down and have at least make 3 films, I'd say, like a solid trilogy. But don't want to speculate too much about what's going to happen, because we don't know what's going to happen after Daniel Craig. So we're going to be in completely new territory after that, which is kind of strange to think about, because I know that, when you were watching Bond films, you had Brosnan into Craig. But for me, at least, I've kind of just had Craig. That was my starting off point. So now I'm going to be in everyone's shoes. Anyway, that's looking too far ahead to the future. Let's talk about the villains with a special emphasis on the plural. There are so many goddamn villains in this film. I was losing track of all of them in this film, but they're all great in their own way. We'll start with the main one. So we've got Mr. Big and obviously his alter ego. Well, Mr. Big is his alter ego, and Dr. Kananga, which I always thought was really confusing. I didn't recall his name from this film. You've got Kananga in this film and Scaramanga in the next film, which is just going to play havoc with my memory with these 2 villains, I think. Again, as we mentioned, like a fairly low-key kind of villain. Like, he's just a drug lord. His plan makes no sense, but it's fine. It's a Bond villain. He wants to basically hand out, I think it's 2 tons of heroin, isn't it? I think that's how much he's got. He wants to hand it out for free to put every other drug lord out of business, so that he is the one and only drug lord, essentially. I think that's kind of what Blofeld was trying to do in terms of nuclear missiles, wasn't it, in one of the previous Bond films? I forget which one it is now. It's probably You Only Live Twice, I think it was. Take out all of the superpowers, was it? And then he'd be like the ultimate arms dealer. I don't know. I think he's a fine character. I would have liked to have seen more of the alter ego of Mr. Big, actually. I think, but if you had him on screen more of the time, you would have probably have sensed that something was up, especially with the face. There's a moment right before the reveal, actually, where I clocked onto it that his face looked kind of plasticky. And then obviously he takes off the mask. I think there is sort of like a fascinating edge to the character. He's not as sort of cartoony as most of the other Bond villains, so maybe that's why he's not as memorable in sort of like the whole roster of Bond villains, perhaps. But I do like qualities that the actor was able to bring to it, and I guess this kind of ties in with the actual sort of like theme of the character as well. He's a very superstitious man, and I like the whole that he does have his, part of himself sort of like steeped in the whole mysticism and voodoo and fortune telling kind of thing. I think that kind of brings quite a nice edge to the character. I think even the actor himself mentioned that he quite liked that because, maybe this was just himself when he was getting into character. He felt like the character was trying to control the past, the present, and the future through his fortune telling and sort of predicting where things were going to go based on the cards. So I love that aspect to it. Love the whole voodoo thing. But he is just I think he gets lost in all the other villains that are in the film. Because I actually think that this is probably one where the henchmen overshadow the main villain. And maybe you could argue that that's a thing in most of the Bond films, especially when you have like Odd Job, but Goldfinger is still the name of the film itself, and Goldfinger's memorable in his own way and still gets a lot to do in that film. I think that Kananga just kind of gets lost in the minutiae of all of these other villains and side characters, really. So I'd say his death, we'll talk about that. I don't know if that's going to be in a best scene or a worst scene. In all honesty, it could go into either one, but his death scene's memorable. But I think it's just the character. And I know that the actor, Yaphet Kotto, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, had a lot of problems with the script, with Mankiewicz's script, saying that it was very stereotypical and that he had to kind of dig deep as an actor. Because as an actor, I guess you can kind of have an input into the screenplay. You can suggest things, you can maybe bring your own spin to it, but inherently, whatever the producers have okayed and the directors okayed with that screenplay is the thing that's going to get filmed. And you can't get too precious about what is in the film and not. But I know that he had a lot of problems with some of the stereotyping that Mankiewicz brought into it and some of the culturally insensitive stuff that was in the script. I think you still do get aspects of that. I don't think that, they're completely high and dry with that stuff, but I'm wondering if there was even more maybe in the initial script. But you mentioned, it was his duty as an actor to just sort of knuckle down, take a breath and just act what he can and maybe downplay some of the more egregious parts, perhaps.
Yeah, Kanang is interesting because it's the fact it's the dual sort of villain, the alter ego that, the alter ego is the drug dealer, the kingpin, and the other side of him is the politician. And I know it sounds silly that we know, so there are so many corrupt politicians and whatnot, we can all look at that and laugh and stuff, but I think because they're obviously such opposites, which alter ego should be, but it's the fact that normally you'd probably have their main persona being the outspoken, over-the-top one, and the alter ego would be the sophisticated, calm one, whereas this one's like a role reversal that his alter ego is obviously Mr. Big, and the politician Kananga is the main villain. I think that's what I really enjoy about him, that I don't think the writing's great, but I think his performance is one of the better Bond villains by a country mile, and I think it's the way the film set up who he surrounds himself with, that because the villain has these other interests that, okay, yes, there's boring stuff with drugs, but the whole sort of the voodoo stuff with Solitaire, his story with her, and he's got his henchmen. It's a really interesting setup for that villain. He's got the villainous lair. He's got his other things going on, and he's really fascinating when you get into him more and more. And I think the big thing with him for me is looking at this, and I'm trying to run them by my head right now. I think this is the only Bond film. This is a good thing or a bad thing, which has, it's a dictator from a fictional country, right? Mm-hmm. How often does Bond execute the political leader? We've probably seen generals and whatnot off the top of my head, but in terms of political figures, I don't know if we've seen it. Certainly not before this, but I'm really trying to think after now. I think this is the only time he's killed a politician, and you look at it, it's kind of bad, but at the same time, it kind of makes it feel a bit different that the villain was a politician. It wasn't a man that's goal is to be the most evil man in the world and be the evil leader of the evil group. It was a politician that was running something on the side. And I think that's where this film and the more era starts to separate, that yes, we're still going to get those insane villains that want to take over the world, don't get me wrong, but the fact we get something different for a couple of them. And it goes back to Goldfinger again, doesn't it? Goldfinger's plan wasn't world domination. It was all about banking himself and getting rich, etc., etc. So it's nice to get something different. And I think at this point, when you're, 8 films into the franchise, you need something different. You can't have the same thing over and over. And I think he's a really interesting step in the dark. And also this puts us on a really good villain streak for new villains for the next couple of films at least.
No, I agree with you completely there. Even though his side villains that go with him all have interesting and unique things added to them that makes them kind of stand out, he is the puppet pulling all the strings behind the scenes, and that to me stands out even more within the film. His acting performance was good. I once again agree with you. The writing was not good. Very interesting to add on to that, because I did a quick search up thinking, seeing if I could link things together. The war on drugs was, the term at least was coined 2 years before this film came out. And was kind of started with that kind of campaign 2 years before this film came out. So that's kind of exactly the vibe that they were going for, keeping that thing that's in the public eye being kind of the main cause of it. And, drugs are bad. We must stop the people with the drugs because that's the world's biggest issue right now, or at least from the American side of things. Back then, it was their big issue, and therefore it ended up being Bond's big issue. So maybe that's how it came into it that way. However, it was really actually quite sad. I just looked up that Yaphet Kotto actually died this year. I had no idea. In March, which is really sad because I don't think there was many news outlets or anything like that. I didn't see any. I
remember it. He was. I think more people know him for Alien than they do Bond, which is always interesting. Because I'm the other way around. I've always seen him as the Bond villain, whereas a lot of people I obviously speak about Alien with. So I'm not gonna lie, they're the only films I've seen him in, but yeah, that was a couple of months ago now, and it's I think when you get the sort of the Bond stuff and you're on this, it's obviously really sad, but you do get that when we read into so many of these older films, we get a lot of the Bond actors that start to pass and whatnot. Obviously, we lost Connery a couple months ago. That's the sort of the not scary thing, the Bond films, but because it's such an iconic classic franchise, it is seeing like how the time. I mean, we're on the 60th anniversary next year, which is insane to think about 60 years. I remember the 50th anniversary, and I'm sure there'll be people that remember the 40th anniversary for Die Another Day. So it's always really interesting seeing that sort of the Bond conversations with all that.
Yeah, Nikolai agrees as well. He says, for me, Dr. Kananga is one of the best Bond villains. He's in my top 10. I love how he puts on a very stereotypically black performance as Mr. Big, but is so sophisticated yet dangerous as himself. Yeah, I can absolutely see that. I do want to say as well that as his persona as Mr. Big, he does have probably my favorite line so far out of all the Bond films. Not counting some of the one-liners, because the one-liners are always great, but I think James, it's in his first confrontation with Bond, and I think Bond says something like, "Don't you want to know my name?" And he's like, "Names is for tombstones, baby." I just thought that was such a cool line, such a cool line. And then you go into your blaxploitation stuff. Then and he says something, "You'll take this honky out and waste him," and that is just so of the time with those kind of films, and. You've got the gangsters, the pimpmobiles, isn't there, in this film at some point? We've mentioned like the whole drug trafficking thing, which was, a very common plot line in most of these films that came out. And the fact that you do have it set in, African-American communities, you've got Harlem, New Orleans are like probably the two biggest ones in the film. Does feel very much like that, but I think the villains probably steal the show for me in this one. I love Roger Moore, but I think the villains definitely do shine through with this one, including some of the other ones that we're going to go into now, like the henchmen. So I think probably the next biggest villain in the film is Teehee Johnson, who I've listed as Hook Guy. He's great in this film, and I like that he's the one that comes back at the end. That's kind of like the formula now for Bond. You dispatch with your main villain, and then there's always someone at the end for like a final fight towards the end of the film. I thought he was great. It just looked like he was having a lot of fun playing the character. It's an interesting quirk. It's either that they're very big and physically imposing, or they've got some kind of ailment or quirk to them. It did kind of remind me, I suppose, of Dr. No with the whole claw hand. So we are kind of getting to the stage now where we're repeating things. But I guess as opposed to a claw hand, it's a whole arm this time, which does lead to one of the best one-liners in the film, which we'll get onto later when we get into the Bond one-liners. But yeah, I thought he was great. And if I'm going to group all the other ones as well, you've got Baron Samedi, the voodoo guy as well, who doesn't have a whole lot to do in this film. He just kind of laughs in an amazing way, but like a great sort of like imposing, memorable presence in the film. He even gets the final shot of the film as well, which is very memorable, which was probably one of the things that stuck out to me as one of the things that I remember the most. And even a henchman such as Whisper, who doesn't have much to say in the film, and when he does, obviously it goes with his namesake, but they're all so memorable. The villains are great in this film, but I would say that there's almost too many villains in this film. It did get to the stage where I was kind of getting overwhelmed with the amount of villains that we had, but despite even the fact that you have got so many villains in this film, they're all kind of memorable and quirky in their own right, which I think is another reason why I like this film so much. Not as much as I remember, but I think why it still does have like a soft spot in my heart, really.
No, absolutely. I'm just going to bring a quick comment. Henek's joining us. Kananga's his favourite Bond villain because of the performance, which is fair. The supporting villains are incredible. I kind of mentioned earlier about iconography. Before I saw this for the first time, I think if anyone has not seen this film but has seen clips, I guess you'd say GIFs these days, photos, every single person's going to think Baron Samedi is the main villain, right? I did as a kid. And it's just that amazing makeup and everything, the laugh, it works so well. And I always forget that he's not the villain, and the fight's so pathetic when he gets like punched into the coffin. It's like it's not an elongated henchman. It's just like swipe, punch, and you're in. But then I think it's meant to be ambiguous. That is he alive? Because you get that clip at the end of him on the train.
Could be voodoo, right? He could be the at the end. Yeah,
and that's the thing, and that's why I love it, because it's so different for James Bond. It's I don't know if this is the only Bond film that does the sort of supernatural elements as well. I think that really works in its favor. But these guys, Whisper as well, ambiguous ending. No one knows to this day if he died or not. He was put in that rocket, and we never saw him again.
Yeah, well, that's good.
He could he have died from compressed air? Did he get arrested after, or did no one ever go back down to that lair and just die eventually? I don't know, and we'll never know. But it's one of them. But T.H. Johnson's amazing. It's the name, like T.H. Johnson. Yeah. What's the name? And the whole hand. And I always laugh is that when I watch this film, it's really sounds like a boring cinema into crap, but you can always see his real life hand underneath. Like it's always like flopping and stuff. And then it's like the big revelation that I lost my entire arm. I was like, did you? Because I can see it, and it's amazing. But I love at the end when they get creative with how Roger Moore takes him out as well. I absolutely love him, and I think that's what you want from a film. Even if it's not the best Bond film, you want those memorable things from it. And I think this is why, although I'm not with it in story, everything else in this film is near perfect for Bond standards from what you want to see from a Bond film.
It's
a film with really quickly. Sorry,
go on.
Some say he's still whispering. I love that.
It's a film with memorable moments, but in the end, overall, not the best kind of things to go along with it. Like the villains in this film are memorable in every single way. Like I always remembered as a kid, like you said, like Baron Samedi, I always thought was the main villain just from the iconography of the kind of makeup and stuff like that. Jeffrey Holder, I did not realize this until I clicked on his IMDb, was the narrator in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory film from 2005.
Oh, no way.
That booming laugh and voice was transferred obviously into that film, which is fantastic. But all the villains serve their purpose so well and have their own moment to shine. It isn't like, one villain's given more screen time than the other, and no, they're all given almost equal amount of time for you to kind of get to know who they are, learn a little bit of backstory about their character, and then Bond to eventually defeat them. Obviously, we don't know what happens to all of them, but with most of them, we kind of can make guesses as to what their fate of their characters are. But really good ensemble of villains.
Yeah, I'm loving the hype right now as well for Baron Samedi. We've got Hennek in the comments. Baron Samedi is impressively creepy, and Nikolai as well. I absolutely adore this villain ensemble. They all serve a purpose and are all memorable and fun. Jeffrey Holder as Baron Samedi is just, I mean, that laugh can shake mountains and sink ships. It absolutely can. Instantly memorable. And as I mentioned, like that laughing face at the end, like what a chilling image to end the film on as well. So good. And you even still have like many of the tropes that you did get in the previous Bond films as well. Like I do say that, Kananga is a much more restrained villain, maybe in terms of his motive, but he does have a villain base at the end. He does have an underground lair with a monorail, just like You Only Live Twice. So you got to throw that in there. He's got a shark tank. He's got all the bells and whistles, which is, that doesn't make much sense when you think that this is an underground lair that's underneath a cemetery. Like, okay, so that's very strange. But going back to Samedi, I love just all the iconography with him, like the laugh that we mentioned, the dancing, the snake, the voodoo stuff. One of my favorite bits in the film is when he like rises out of the grave and it's actually like a porcelain statue. Just so good, so good. So I love all that stuff. Shall we? Actually, before we get onto the Bond girls, Hennek's already mentioned here, but I did want to bring it up. The character Dr. Kananga was named after Ross Kananga, the alligator wrangler. Absolutely, he was the guy who actually did the stunt. I believe took 5 takes to do it, and in the 5th take, an alligator went for his ankle, only ripped his trouser leg, so there were no accidents there. I think they discovered him. They were location shooting. And then there was this particularly memorable sign that they saw, which was like a crocodile alligator farm, and there's actually a picture of this very sign on Wikipedia. Trespassers will be eaten, which is just like, whoa, that's going to get your attention. So obviously they spoke to him, and that was the location for the drug lab and the crocodile thing. So I think that's probably one of the best sequences. I'm probably going to save that for one of my best scenes. It's kind of cheesy, but it is also one of those moments where you do think, how is Bond going to get out of this one? And it did make me question. And obviously you remember the watch, which we'll talk about later as well in terms of gadgets. As an interesting side thing, that was actually one of the stipulations that they didn't bring Q back for this film. They freed up the actor's schedule, but then I think the producer said that Bond had become too reliant on the gadgets, despite the fact that the one gadget that he has in this film is probably one of the most important gadgets that he's had out of any of the films. It crops up many times throughout the film and kind of saves the day at the end. So I don't think it would have been out of place to have Q in the film. But interesting bit of trivia, and just goes to show that, what location scouting can lead to. any other location, they wouldn't have come across that. Maybe that wouldn't have even been one of the ideas in the film, but I do think as it stands, it is one of the most standout stunts in the film, and probably one of the sort of like most, like in terms of iconography, you're like, oh, it's the one with the alligators, it's the one with the crocodiles. It's all down to this.
Yeah, I think as well, sort of that side piece, I think the Wrangler died very young. I think he was like 32, 33. And it wasn't an alligator eating him, which is what I thought when I started reading into it. But no, I think this is what you want from Bond. You want the memorable stuff. That we get a Shark Tank, right? And you know my thoughts on sharks.
Yeah, I did. I was watching that, thinking about that. Like, how's this going over with George? Is he okay?
And this, it's like, I think because Thunderball did it so well. It's like, do we need another Shark Tank? And
there are more Shark Tanks. As
I was going to say.
Along.
And that's the thing. Like, it just felt a bit weird because I think the alligator scene's done so well. That's what's like, did we need the sharks really? But they're not really used as well. That's the other thing. They're kind of pointless. They don't really do anything unless they're going to eat remains of a balloon, which we'll get to. But no, let's talk some of the Bond girls as well. Opening scene, Miss Caruso, the Italian one. I think everyone knows her as, I think, most famous for the magnetic zip.
Don't you dare do that.
I'm not saying I'm not
come up later.
I'm not saying the line, don't worry, but I just think it's one of those where, if you want to get introduced to Bond, it's the iconography, isn't it, that he's with someone, and I think that does work to his advantage, especially for Roger Moore. Connery's the iconic one, but Roger Moore's the one that he doesn't really have a set standard to go for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. At the start of this film, like I've seen this film recently as well. I genuinely can't remember this opening scene with him with the Bond, which is really sad. And I think you guys are talking about how it's quite kind of low key and stuff like that. That like he's being introduced, but for me, I do remember those scenes where a new Bond gets introduced. Like, for me, fully ingrained into my mind, Pierce Brosnan jumping off of the Hoover Dam is absolutely just, like, embedded in there because that's how I was introduced into his Bond. And same with Sean Connery lighting the cigarette at the bar and stuff like that. Or at the was it a poker table?
Roulette
that
table,
is just,
wasn't it?
yeah, the roulette table. Immediately, like, okay, that's his introduction. I know this is a good introduction as Roger Moore to being the Bond, but I would have personally wanted something a little bit more, especially because in the end, this film does have two other Bond girls who do have a lot more to do in the film. So it would have been possibly nicer if there was some kind of continuation of that.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it pretty much it does set the tone for Roger Moore, though, like his incarnation of Bond. Like, obviously, he does do action scenes. I'm not saying he doesn't, and he does them well, at least in the first few films, as we mentioned earlier. But it's very much more that tongue-in-cheek, campy tone to him, which you establish from his opening scene, and I do think that continues at least into all of the Roger Moore films that I've seen. Haven't seen all of the Roger Moore films at this point. But Madeline Smith plays Miss Caruso. Apparently, I don't know if Roger Moore suggested her because he'd appeared on television with her. What's really interesting, though, is that Roger Moore's wife was on set overseeing everything. So apparently that was really, really uncomfortable for Madeline Smith, who had to perform without a top on. She was just in like bottoms during that scene. So I did think that was kind of funny.
She's just performing, and then she just looks over and just the evil's being darted across the room.
But let's talk one of the very short-lived Bond girl in this film. So I'm actually trying to find the name real quick here.
Rosie Carver.
Rosie Carver. Gloria Hendry's the actress. I think Mankiewicz was actually one of the proponents who wanted a black Bond girl, like the first black Bond girl. But it was producers, and I was going to come down on thunder like this, but apparently in Ian Fleming's book, the main Bond girl is a white woman, and the producers wanted to stay true to the book in that regard, which is kind of confusing because you think about all the other deviations that they've gone from the book, and this would have been the prime time to do it. I couldn't remember any of the Bond women from this film going back on a rewatch to this film, and I was really disappointed actually when Carver was taken out of the movie. I didn't particularly like her character up until that point, but I felt like she was a character that could have grown over the rest of the film. She starts out kind of, she doesn't know how to use a gun. She can't take the safety off it. But I felt like by the end, you could have her really come into her own and maybe do the thing that they've done in previous Bond films, like Domino, where they come in to save the day at the very end of the film, or Romanova or something like that. Have more to do. As it stands, it's really just kind of a massive missed opportunity. And maybe with sort of a modern lens now and sort of being more aware of this and what goes on in Hollywood, it's like, oh, we've got a white woman. We can't have the black girl be the Bond girl. We've got to go back to the tried and tested, and that goes back to the 70s, because we still think like it was still so bad, even in the times of what doesn't seem all that long ago, really, like the 70s and the 80s. I did actually read that I think Mankiewicz wanted Diana Ross to be the Bond girl in this film. So imagine if they'd have got her, what you would have had for the Bond theme as well. That would have been a really good combination. As it stands, I don't mind Carver, but she is kind of an annoying character, but she is a character that I think that given the chance and maybe with the writing, she could have developed. But again, with Mankiewicz doing it, we know what Tiffany Case was like in Diamonds Are Forever, so maybe I wouldn't hold my breath too much.
Yeah, I'm really torn on this. Obviously, I've not read the Bond books. I feel like I should have read them when we started doing these, but there's so many and they're so different. But from what I have heard, so obviously I'm doing too much for it, Live and Let Die is meant to be very, very racist in the books, which is obviously written back, probably 50s, I think, that one. I can't remember on the earlier ones.
Yeah, it was 50s, I think. Let me try and check the date on that.
We know that they're not ready for a black lead Bond girl in 1973, and
it was 54. I'm trying to remember. Sorry, just briefly. 54.
So it's 20, almost 20 years later, and this is it. I think when you look at this film, because originally I think with Diana Ross they wanted to play Solitaire, and I think that would have, if you look at the film as a whole, that would have worked, especially with the sort of villain ensemble. I don't want to say she would have fitted in. That sounds like I'm sort of being racist, but it's very much like it's kind of like that. That okay, we want a black Bond girl, but we can't have her be the one we want her to be, so we'll just write someone in to get rid quickly, because the deaths... I mean, I love the weird scarecrow gun in the mouth thing. Like, it's a really cool contractual design, but the death's pathetic, and you spent a lot of time getting to know her, and it's just gone. And then you're in with Solitaire, and I know that's a problem a lot of Bond films have, that, yes, they do kill some of them off, but the worst ones are ones they just kind of get killed for no reason, and then you move on, and James Bond doesn't care. And I think she does fall under that. And I don't know. I think if Solitaire had been Black Actress, I think that'd been really interesting for this film. But at the same time, there was no way. I mean, I think producers are probably, as you said, Chris, this is the one time they choose to stick to the in the books type message when we all know what the reality of the situation is. And then I'm trying to think if there was a black Bond girl before Halle Berry in terms of the leading.
I was just thinking back on that.
I'm just thinking that in my head.
I cannot remember any.
Nikolai's just mentioned something. Now, I don't know this character from what I've seen. He's put for a first African-American Bond girl, Rosie isn't great and killed off in a bit of a mean-spirited way. I think Mayday was what Carver wasn't in terms of black Bond girls.
Mayday is in A View to a Kill.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Played by Grace Jones. So the singer as well, which I'm surprised they didn't go with her. Obviously, they went with Duran Duran in the end for that. But no, I'm not a big fan of this Bond girl, and it's frustrating because, like Chris said, there was loads of potential that you could have had there, and of course, like having a black actress playing Solitaire would have been fantastic for the film for the time, but the studio obviously wasn't ready for it at that point. So in the end, you're left with what is quite a weak, underpowered Bond girl that doesn't really know what she's doing, and in the end gets killed off in a very, very lame way. It's really disappointing watching back with the potential that could have been there, especially because in the end, Solitaire ends up being a fantastic character. I'm not saying that Jane Seymour was the wrong actress for it, but it would have been a much more powerful performance, possibly if it came from a black actress in this style of film. That goes nothing against Jane Seymour. I think her performance as Solitaire is actually one of the best Bond girls. But imagine how powerful it would have been if it was a black actress in that role in this film that's kind of not targeted at that kind of genre or audience, but just in the context of the film.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it is a very stereotypical film. I think it's fair to say, and a lot of the films that were in this genre were at the time. That was just how it was. So I think it would have worked more in terms of the tone that this film was trying to, broker with the whole blaxploitation thing. Let's talk about Solitaire then. So Jane Seymour, I like the concept of the character. This kind of ties in with what I was saying with Kananga as well. The whole fortune telling thing. I mean, that is steeped in kind of New Orleans. That whole kind of thing, the voodoo aspect to it, and fortune telling. I really like that aspect to her, and that she is, against her will almost. She is like a henchwoman. She's one of those Bond girls that is kind of tied in with the villain and wants to, and defects sides and turns to the good side by the end of it. She wants to get away. I do like that, but as soon as Bond sleeps with her, she's just a nothing of a character to me. And she's just a very, very passive character just there along for the ride. I guess I've been spoiled with, Diana Rigg, who I keep going back to as one of my favorites. Even before that, there's other cases where the Bond girl at least does something. So I like the concept of a character, and I like that she's initially working for the villain as a fortune teller, and sort of, I love that sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not the occult. That's not the right word for it, but that whole aspect to it, the mysticism of the character. I like that. There's even reference to her mother, I think, as well, who was working beforehand, who was the fortune teller beforehand. So it sounds like the sort of like the mantle of the fortune teller as part of this organization has been like a long running generational thing. And I like that kind of lore towards the character. And this isn't anything against Jane Seymour. I think it's just down to the writing again. It's just that she really doesn't have anything to do. And she's just kind of there to be a hostage with Bond at the end, and, for him to essentially fall in love with for this film. And that's kind of where I stand with Solitaire. I like the concept, but sort of the execution towards the end, not great.
Yeah, it's as cheesy as you can get at this. What card have I drawn for you? It's like, okay, well, you're Roger Moore, so it's going to clearly be lovers without anyone needing to second guess it before. And I like the whole angle that it is that supernatural, that she's a fortune teller, and it works. And there's all that weird stuff. At the same time, it's so creepy because I think she was only like 20 when she did it. And it's that whole much like, how old Moore at this point? Is he in his 40s?
Let's figure it out.
This is going to be a running theme, and
if that's a problem with this film, then like,
yeah, I'm
bringing
saying
it up every single video.
It's just one of them where I think she's great as sort of playing that innocent character. But usually, Chris, once they sleep together, it's kind of you're just there with him now, and you don't really feel that tension. Because I think she's a great performance, but again, it's someone having another great performance when they're not working with the best things to write with. And I think, again, it is that. And what you want from the Bond girls are you've got the incredible costume design, which I think does help that sort of stand out. It doesn't look like every other Bond girl. And I think one of the unfortunate, funniest things in the entire Bond franchise is when he just lobs her in the bed at the end of the film into the wall. And I don't know why I always find that so funny, but it's that kind of ridiculous Bond thing. Like, we literally just don't need you for a couple of minutes. And I think that sort of sums it all up too, in a politer way.
So she was 22. He was 46.
It's fine. It's fine, right? That's fine.
It's just I think because we laugh so much when we get to View to a Kill. It's mental to think.
Oh, it gets way worse as it goes on.
I guess it's more of a more thing. I think because he doesn't look like he's in his mid-40s in truth. I think he doesn't look too bad age-wise. I think it's just because of how bad it gets towards the end. He looks a lot younger than Sean Connery does in Diamonds Are Forever. And Connery's younger than him, which is insane to think about still. So I think it's just one of those unfortunate ones that, I think without getting ageist, I think one of the big discussions for the future of the franchise is, I always say that Idris Elba would have made a phenomenal, fantastic James Bond 8 years ago. Because he's in his, I think, early to mid-50s now, and by the time the film gets made.
On the same kind of theme as that, I know we'll get round to it when we get to the film, but with Daniel Craig and, was it Monica Bellucci?
Yeah, in Spectre, when they thought, oh, look, we're going to get an older Bond.
Yeah, older Bond girl. And that
and it was a one scene and done.
Yeah.
Quite literally, so...
Like, it could have been more, but...
I think the Bond stuff, I think age... does become a big thing as they've got later, and I think at least what I will say, it seems that certainly with Spectre, he seemed tired as in the character, not just the.
We've lost George.
It happens.
So I think there are
with this.
There we go. Back.
I was just going to say, I think with the age, I think because the more films acknowledge it. Sorry to kick me out again.
It's
you're there,
freezing.
but you're not there.
I'm there. Okay, sorry, my internet's been poor, but yeah, I think the age shift of the Bond films, it just comes down to when the films are pretending that he's not old.
Oh no! Oh no! It's worse than ever this time. Oh dear!
He's leaving us on a knife edge here, George.
This better be a good point, George, because the amount of hype that's been built up. Right. Well, I'm going to go to a comment. I'm going to go to a comment real quick while we wait for George to come back in. I agree on Solitaire. She's a fan favorite, but her character is underwritten. By the way, did you notice that her tarot cards say 007 on the back? Sneaky meta commentary. I actually didn't. I mentioned this to you, Tate, before we went live. Salvador Dali was actually approached originally to do the art for the cards, but he wanted too much money, so they ended up going with someone else. But apparently, Dali still released that deck of tarot cards that he did in 1984. So
apparently, you can buy the 007 tarot cards as well.
I was wondering that'd be pretty cool to have, I think, in terms of merch. George, you're back. Cool. Sorry, what were you saying beforehand?
Before that, I'm going to make a dig about the James Bond store. If you ever want to buy some merch, just add a 0 to what it's worth, and that's what they always sell everything for.
Yeah.
Age-wise, all I was going to say is, I think with the Moore films, they don't ever treat him like he's grown age. He's that same character from film 1 to film 7. You know, there might be the odd passing line and whatnot, whereas the Craig film, it feels like an integrated story, that he has grown, that he has aged, that he is older, he is more vulnerable. And I think that's where these films differ, whereas when you get to, Views for Kill, and they're playing that suave, sophisticated young spy when he's really double the age of what it should be, that's where you get the issues. And I think that's what the Bond films are going to, hope take into consideration when they, when the next Bond comes in. I'm sure they'll be looking at it that, this is a leading role you got to commit to for 10, maybe 12 years. And this is a film that when we call you, you have to turn up. And I think that's what's going to be a big thing, and age is very important. And I think obviously we've missed out on a lot of great Bonds, as I guess every generation does.
I guess we move on to the music now.
Yes.
One of the most. I had a very interesting debate here with my family about this, because it is one of the most recognizable Bond songs.
Yeah.
It is one of the most famous Bond songs, if not the most famous Bond song.
It was nominated for the Academy Award, I think.
Yes. When we get to the rankings, because we're doing a rankings of Bond songs at the end of this, I don't think this is going to be ridiculously high on my list. And it's not because I don't like the song. It's because Bond does have some amazing themes and amazing tunes. And I just don't think this song fits the film. And that's probably going to be the reason why it's going to slide down the list. I think fantastic song on its own. I think it's probably overplayed in popular culture nowadays. But when you put it in the context of the film, usually the Bond song fits to the kind of themes of the film, and you can kind of get a vibe of what the film's going to be like and stuff like that. This doesn't fit it even slightly. It's like the song was written for a completely different film.
I kind of agree with that. Before I get to the actual theme itself, I just want to talk about there is a noticeable absence in terms of music with this film, and that's a lack of a John Barry. He didn't come back for this film. I think it was probably like scheduling conflicts or something. I didn't really read into the reason why. But how they got to the composer. So the composer who did the score for this film was George Martin, who was actually the producer of Paul McCartney when he was in the Beatles. So you've got the link there. Apparently when they brought Paul McCartney on and his wife Linda to write the theme, Paul McCartney demanded a massive salary to obviously do the music for the film. They didn't really have all that much money left after for the music budget to then get a composer in, like a big composer, or maybe even Barry at that point. So they settled for George Martin, who was the producer, as I mentioned, of Paul McCartney when he was in the Beatles. This was probably a bit awkward as well, because Saltzman, obviously one of the producers of the Bond films, he refused to produce A Hard Day's Night, which was obviously the Beatles movie as well. So there's probably a bit, maybe he was trying to make amends to Paul McCartney through this film, offering him the gig for it. As a theme, I think it's great. Just as a song in its own right, really. I think it's probably one of those that when you hear it, it is intrinsically tied to Bond. So I think maybe it is difficult to differentiate the two, but when you hear Goldfinger, for example, and you've got that brass and you've got that Barry sound to it, that immediately makes you think of Bond. If you just listen to this is just a great sort of like rock and roll song, really, that you could listen to. Absolutely lethal when you're driving down the motorway, I will say, when that main riff kicks in. And a great cover song as well by Guns N' Roses that also covered this song. Really good version of it too. But I do kind of agree with you, Tate, in that, well, number one, I'm probably going to cause a lot of I'm going to cause a stir by saying this. I've never been a big Paul McCartney and a Beatles fan. I appreciate them musically.
Are you a Stones fan? That's the question, because normally it goes in that direction.
I prefer the Stones to the Beatles. I'm not massively keen on either, but I would prefer listening to the Stones over the Beatles any day. I appreciate the stamp in music history and the musicianship, everything like that. But just to me, the music doesn't speak to me. But as a theme, it's good. But I actually found this out. So there's a moment in the film, and I did make a note of this as well. I think it's the first Bond theme that we've had so far that actually appears in universe within the film itself. You've got singer BJR Now, I think is how you pronounce it. And when they go to Fileo Soul, the sort of like the club that they go to, she's performing it on stage there. She was originally hired by the producers to sing the song for this film. Because I think they were under the impression that Paul McCartney and his wife were only going to write the song, and then they were like, "Oh, you want to perform it as well? Sure, yes, Mr. Paul McCartney, you can perform the song as well." But as sort of like a sign of goodwill, they allowed her to have that scene in the film where she does sing it. I prefer her version in terms of the context of this film. I think when you hear that song, it very much fits into the kind of blaxploitation tone that the film is going for. You've kind of got that like funk guitar to it and everything. It sounds like it's fresh out of Shaft or something like that. And I think that as a song, that would fit the tone of the film more and the setting of the film. But obviously, Paul McCartney's version's a lot more polished as just a sort of more commercial song. And commercial it was. I think it got to like number 2 in the charts in the UK. I think it was number 2 in the US, sorry. And I think it was like number 9 for us in the UK, which is quite surprising, actually. I thought it would be higher in UK charts. As a theme, it's great. As a song, it's great. But maybe as a Bond song, what you would consider a Bond song, maybe it isn't up there with like the upper echelons of some of the other Bond themes.
Before I talk about Paul McCartney, I just want to quickly say that it's a good thing that there's no RR between George and Martin, or else we'd still be waiting for the soundtrack to come out in 2021. Right. Chris, I'm the same as you. I mean, music's not my forte at all, in truth, but I've never really liked the Beatles, except when it's like football songs that is a Beatles song, which I don't know because I used to chant the footballer's name. But yeah, I never liked them. Prefer the Rolling Stones, and I respect them, but I just don't even know enough about them to really care. And I prefer the Kinks anyway. But this is a song that I think, because it's one of those few Bond songs, probably, I mean, all the time in the world, I guess, is probably the big one. It's a bigger song than it's known more so for the song itself than the film itself. That, you know, I was saying before we hit live earlier that I always think back to when I watched Britain's Got Talent when I was younger. And it doesn't matter what dancing troupe was on, or like gymnast or something, Live and Let Die is always like one of the bog standard songs that they'd play on the live shows all the time. And for years and years, it was a song that was used so much in pop culture. It's like, oh, this was a James Bond song once, and because it doesn't instinctively feel like a Bond song, that's where it stands out. But I think when I sort of look at it from that perspective, that this is new territory for James Bond, as you said, the blaxploitation would have worked better with maybe another singer, but I think this was their big message for this new Bond, new era, something different, and it's Paul McCartney coming in. You know, I obviously a lot of the other people they had to do themes were big names, but obviously none of them were as big as, you know, early 70s Paul McCartney. That's probably the biggest name I'd say that's took on a Bond song at the moment. They take on that job, and maybe it probably is on paper still the biggest person to ever sung a Bond song, but I love the song. As you said, it's one of those classic motorway ones, but it just feels different, and I think that's where it stands out. Even the sort of the little instruments they use, I can even tell you what they are, the little clangs and things that play throughout it. It all fits in, and I think when you get the matching animation, that it's so different from the other films again, that it's helping it stand out further. So this is a Bond song I've got a lot of time for, and it's one that's not a massive fan of the Beatles. It's kind of like a, you know, I mean, I think for years, because they call it Wings, don't they? They don't call it Paul McCartney.
Yeah, it was
Paul McCartney and Wings.
yeah.
So it's even one of them where it's like, people. Well, I would assume the Beatles, because obviously I wouldn't know about the history, and if they broke up by then, I don't know. So I'm just gonna bow out now.
Well, it's so weird because I quite like the Beatles and I quite like Paul McCartney, and I like this song, but it does slide down on the Bond song list. It's a good song, but it slides down when we get to doing that list overall of all the Bond songs.
We mentioned the title sequence as well there. Nikolai right there with the title sequence and song with the faces turning into skulls actually really scared me as a child. Yeah, I can imagine that happening. It reminds me of a film that actually wouldn't come out until 5 years after this film, but obviously because it's the one that I've seen more times than I have this one. The beginning of John Carpenter's Halloween, where you have the slow zoom in on the jack-o'-lantern pumpkin at the beginning, like the kind of face, like the skull kind of face. It just reminded me of that for some reason, maybe like the flames and the lighting and everything like that. We've had a question from Nikolai as well. What did we think of David Hedison as Felix Leiter and of Quarrel Jr.? I didn't know his name. I couldn't place the name, but Quarrel Jr. apparently he's the son of Quarrel from Dr. No.
Dr. No.
I really liked his character. I like how he talked and conducted himself. I'm not sure if he comes back in future Bond films. It said that Quarrel Jr. is sort of like a long-running ally of Bond. I don't know if that's more in the books than it is in the films. Roy Stewart playing him. I enjoyed his character. David Hedison, I did some reading earlier that he actually comes back in License to Kill, which is very random. Like, I know that they bring actors back, but that's quite late in the game.
16 years.
Yeah, following this one. So I'm guessing that Felix doesn't crop up in a film after this point until License to Kill. Is that right? Or
it's License to Kill. Obviously, I know you've not seen it. Obviously, you guys, everyone else at home will know. It's more personal, which makes it it made sense to bring him back for it. At the same time, it's weird because obviously it's not Roger Moore, is it? It's Timothy Dalton. So it's it will be very interesting, I think, when we get to that. But listen, I love Jeffrey Wright playing him in the new films. It's nice to get a bit of recurrence from people that we can laugh at how many characters get recast and whatnot. But to bring him back for the film where he's actually got a personal stake, I'm all here for it. And I don't mind. I think Felix Leiter is just a character I don't really like. I think because he's been recast so much, I don't care that. Maybe this is more my knowledge of sort of lack of knowledge of cinema back then, but if an American pops up, it's either Felix Leiter or it's just another new character. And I think that's why it feels like that it's just that guy in a suit that's American. And, obviously modern era, Jeffrey Wright, actors, multiple contracts, same character coming back, makes sense. And I think he does it better. He doesn't look like every other American in that film. And I think that's why I actually stand out.
Yeah, I'm completely agreeing with you there. Like, Felix Leiter, watching back through all of these films, the times that he does pop up, it's like, well, it's an American character, it must be Felix. And sometimes they don't even mention his name, or you maybe miss it and you're like, well, he's an American character, so he's got to be Felix. But when we get through to the modern Bond films with Jeffrey Wright, for me, that is Felix Leiter, because I've seen him now 3 films in a row. It's been consistent and his character's almost given more in the films. It's like a cameo in pretty much every other film that he's in. Maybe he'll be given more than one scene, but it will always be, the CIA are here. Therefore, it's more stakes for Bond. He has to get it done before the CIA gets it done, or he has to work with the CIA this time. And that's really why his character's there. It doesn't add much at all to it, in my opinion, until we get into kind of later films.
And Nikolai's just coming right here. He's just a fountain of Bond trivia, this guy. Felix actually pops up in The Living Daylights with a different actor than Hedison, which is a bit weird, but I'm very thankful that Hedison came back for License to Kill. We'll be getting to those films, in many weeks' time. I'm very much looking forward to those two. I honestly cannot wait to get into the Dalton ones. But we're still here with more for right now. Shall we talk about the best scenes from this film? If there's any other standout scenes that we haven't mentioned, any moments, don't do one-liners just yet. We'll get into that later. Thank you very much. But best scenes. I'm trying to think of one for me. I mentioned the crocodile alligator one that just sticks out to me as sort of one of the best. I actually really like the whole funeral procession opening. I think that they, with it being sort of New Orleans, they were thinking of doing the whole Mardi Gras thing, which is, intrinsic to New Orleans culture. But I think the director remembered that there was a similar festival in Thunderball, wasn't it? That's sort of the parade procession that goes through. So he didn't want to do that. So they went with just the big brass band funeral processions. But I thought that was a really how the whole street was kind of in on it. and the coffin where there's like, the bottom seals and they carry the guy away. Really love that intro. So that's probably one of my favorite scenes too. And then sort of like for worst scene, we're going to get onto worst scenes in a minute, but that's kind of tied in with best scenes and worst scenes, because some of the most impressive stunts are in one of my least favorite scenes. So I'm going to save it for least favorite, but some of the boat stunts as well are pretty impressive. I think even one of them set a Guinness World Record at the time for the distance that it jumped. I can't remember the exact number right now, but I think they're probably the big ones. Do we want to chuck the villain's death in there as well? Is that a best moment?
Yeah, I love it. It's so ridiculous that, when you watch a Bond film, anything that is spoken about needs to have a payoff, right? That's the purpose of them. And when he's got the inflatable dart he shoots at the safer, I didn't assume the first time I watched as a kid that man would end up getting inflatable. But I thought, it will be this big contraption. I was like, oh my God, he blew him up, he popped like a balloon. There's no guts, spine, bones, blood, organs popping anywhere. He is a balloon, and it is so ridiculous. That's why I think why it's so iconic, and it's such a ridiculous. Imagine like Boris Johnson. How did he die? I don't know. He inflated and popped. Just imagine that scenario in reality. I love it. It is ridiculous, and I think it is. I think with James Bond, it's the over the top villain deaths that have always helped to make it, and there is nothing more impressive than a man popping. So that's one of the best things. I think the alligator scene is probably my favorite scene of the film. In truth, I don't think there's many great films. There's great scenes. I think it's very consistent, and I think any scene of Baron Samedi, and it's cheap for me to say, but any scene of him is normally a highlight of the film too.
Mm.
Yeah, I'll second the alligator scene in there because that is one of the things that I remembered most about this film, and it does pay off exactly how I remembered it. It's fantastic to watch. The only thing that I would want to see, that's just from a modern film watching kind of standard, was actually seeing Roger Moore perform that stunt, but I know he would never do that. I feel like that would have been quite fun to watch him actually perform it in the same way that you saw Sean Connery perform a lot of stunts. I know that, they use a lot of stunts in some of the later films as well instead of having Roger Moore in there, but it would have been nice to see that. I want to kind of jump ahead here and go straight into worst scene because I'm not picking a scene, I'm picking a person. And this will probably be the same case in the next film as well. We got to talk about Sheriff Pepper. We have to talk about him because worst James Bond character of all time, possibly. Are we talking about that?
So far out of all the ones I've seen in this retrospective,
insufferable. And we were talking about this in the previous, in the Diamonds Are Forever one, that we brought in the new screenwriter, Mr. Mankiewicz, just to have an American approach to it, to make it friendlier to American audiences and stuff like that. And that all pays off in this one character. I'll say his full name, Sheriff J.W. Pepper, an uncouth Louisiana sheriff. He is just awful. The dialogue that he's given is awful. I swear the acting performance, I can't even tell whether it's a good performance or not because it just chews up the screen in the worst possible way. It's distracting. I know his character is a lot worse in the next film, but it's worth pointing out in this film, he's not very good at all and puts kind of quite a dark stain on. I know you guys aren't the biggest fan of the scene. I know you're going to have it as your worst moment as the longest boat chase of all time.
Yeah,
I quite like that scene. I'm not going to lie. I just kind of not fall asleep, but I just kind of sit back. It's the same way that I would watch a Fast and Furious film. I sit back and watch the dumb mayhem. But he ruins anything that could have been good from that scene just by being there.
Yeah, and I don't blame the actor as well. So Clifton James was the actor because that was the direction he was given. That's how the character was written by Mankiewicz, who was literally written into the film just to be comic relief. And he comes into the film so late in the game, and we haven't really had a comic relief character up to that point. Like, save the comic relief for like the one-liners that Bond drops in all the situations. That's the only comic relief you really need. You didn't need a specific character like this to serve that role. And this just feels like all the kind of carryover from Diamonds Are Forever with me, and everything that was wrong with that film kind of all coalesced into one character, and that's Sheriff J.W. Pepper. I couldn't remember that he comes back for Man with the Golden Gun, so I'm absolutely kind of dreading going into that film now. He's so much
He's
worse.
in Man with the Golden Gun more than he is in this film. That's all I need to say. going into that.
And I think Clifton James, like the actor, I think he's a good character actor. You know, he's like this kind of gurning thing that he keeps doing with his mouth in between lines, but he's so stereotypical, and the scene just out. It goes on for so long. I wish I'd have timed how long the entire boat sequence goes on for. Maybe
I'll find on YouTube. I'll find on YouTube because they'll probably have the entire length of it.
It just felt so long, just needlessly long. And I'm fine with the stunts in there, but there's only so many times that you can watch a speedboat ramping over a patch of land and then going into another canal. And it just goes on. You're just watching boats go from left to right, from left to right to left to right. And then this guy just crops up every now and then and he just absolutely kills it. And I don't know why this character hasn't appeared on more lists for like worst comic relief characters in films. You know, Jar Jar's always the low-hanging fruit from the prequels. I think this character absolutely deserves to be on that too. You know, he's the very stereotypical New Orleans. He's like, "Woohoo, my share," like boy, like that kind of thing.
Well,
it's just
very, very interesting because this has changed slightly my opinion on the character. With Nikolai saying, I actually like Sheriff Pepper. It's more that so in this film than in Man with the Golden Gun. The character was actually written as a FU to the racist Louisiana authorities that wanted to prohibit black stuntmen. So they wrote him as a way to make fun of racists. I respect the character a lot more now, I'm not going to lie. Still doesn't forgive the performance at all.
If it was in just like the one scene. So I would have ended his character contribution when the boat when the boat goes into the cop car and he says like, I'm commandeering, just have him like look at it and that be it, done. There's your comic relief scene. You don't need any more of him after that point.
The scene is 14 minutes long.
Oh god, it felt so much longer. It felt so much longer.
14. That's
18 minutes if you include the entire crocodile scene beforehand as well.
I wouldn't include that, no, because
that's superior. Chris, it's repetitive. It's boat goes left to right, spin around, the odd explosion, the odd jump, and I think I don't like doing the whole should have happened, all that stuff, but when the boat goes into that car, when you get that great standoff, I didn't think first time I watched it, you don't think they're going to jump over, unless it's just me. But they're waiting there because it's the end of the line. They're going to have to stop the boat, and it just doesn't stop. 14 minutes. How long is the scuba diving sequence in Thunderball? Because, I was watching this at 1 a.m. 14 minutes of this at 1 a.m. was not an easy task to get through. And it's not even like fun. They're not even interesting. That yes, you get the jump, you get the one henchman going into the explosion and never coming back, but it just doesn't seem to stop. And you're near the end of the film. You've just had a really good sequence. You had the big plan explained. You've had all of this, and then it's just thrown in there for you to then get onto another sequence for the film to finish. It just leaves you bored, and I just don't think it's obviously at the time, yes, it would have been phenomenal, but I just think there's been better action sequences in the previous Bond films.
So George, these scuba sequences also 14 minutes long.
which gun to my head, which one would I rather watch? That's the
boat sequence, because you know what's happening in the boat sequence. You don't know. It doesn't have
him, and it's got that repetitive song.
Oh, that's a good point. I forgot about that.
Are there any other really long, awful Bond sequences? 14 minutes. Even Spectre, which is the longest Bond film, probably does not have a 14-minute one action sequence. That's a good question.
No, I honestly can't recall any. What I will say is,
in the comments, tell us if there's a more laborious Bond sequence.
I think as well, like the music, Hennick's just put there as well. The score by George Martin rocks the show. When it's present, I might have to go back to this. I don't recall much music during this scene, and maybe that kind of took away some of the excitement of the scene for me as well. I think another thing is that it's mostly sort of filmed in wide shot as well. There's very few scenes where you sort of with Bond himself in that boat, any reaction shots or any sort of like specific character moments with him. It feels like you're very much like a very far away observer of all these stunts happening, which is fine. But I think the sheriff gets way more attention in this scene than even Bond does, or even the person chasing him. And by the time you've reached the end of 14 minutes, I forgot why this person's chasing Bond and why I should be worried for Bond and what's actually going on, because it's distracted you so many times. But we've actually kind of got some love for Sheriff Pepper in the comments right here.
I feel that love's got to go away by the start of the next discussion, because the next film he is even worse than this film.
So Nikolai says, I actually like Sheriff Pepper in this one more so than the man with the golden gun. The characters. Oh, sorry, you.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
No, sorry, this was the one I meant to bring up. I get that he's a bit too much, but I love his lines about Black Russians attacking and stuff. He's definitely a character that you either love or hate. Maybe he is a Marmite character, but I definitely didn't like his character in this one. But now I'm kind of braced for it. Maybe I'll be able to tolerate him more in the next one. But judging by what you've said and what Nikolai said, I don't know if I'll be able to. But yeah.
Maybe if Chris had $1 million, he would have got Scaramanga with one bullet to take out this guy, not to come back in the next one. But no. Another one, Climax of Tomorrow Never Dies is pretty long, I would say.
I quite like the climax of Tomorrow Never Dies.
The chance Sander Piers Brosnan, Time Over Days is not that long either. But oh god, I don't even know where to go next. Right, any other worse scenes than that? I think the film's just very. I mean, I don't like the shark scene, not because of the sharks, but because it's boring. It's not an interesting climax, and I think it doesn't help. We've had an elongated boat sequence. I love the whole graveyard stuff. I loved all of that with the sacrifice and all that things. And in the moment, it's like run into lair, master plan waiting, and there's like we're going to fight in the shark. I love the whole cutting the veins to lure the sharks in, but the sharks don't get lured in. They don't do anything. And I think that's why when you have something like that, it's a bit of a waste, and we don't need another villain to be fed to sharks because we've had things like that previously. So I don't think there's any of a terrible scene. I just can't stand that boat chase. It's just too much for me. And I think
quite like more of the voodoo stuff you mentioned there. I'd quite like more of that. I thought that had more of a presence in the film than it did. You kind of have the opening scene and then really just kind of like the ending one before you get to the lair, and that's your lot in terms of that stuff. So I don't know, maybe a greater emphasis on that, or have that be the climax somewhere set there. It does kind of devolve into like the typical villain lair, Shark Tank, and before I kill you, Mr. Bond kind of thing. Which, if that wasn't in the film, maybe people would complain that it, that very much didn't feel like a Bond film at that point. You need those ingredients in. It's the formula that we keep always going back to. Nikolai's got another worst scene before we move on to my favorite segment of the show. I got a worst scene, the airplane chase. Now, that is a chase I really dislike in this scene. The plane never even takes off. That's my version of the boat chase, apparently. Yes, I wanted to bring this up, so I did put this on my notes for one-liners. It's not a one-liner. But the woman who's doing the flight lesson says, "Holy shit." Now, is that the first curse word in a Bond film?
Yeah.
Until this point? So that kind of stuck out to me. Yeah, it's not great. It's just more of that campy stuff. The film does like a really good job of like grounding itself. There are campy elements, obviously, to like the voodoo stuff and everything like that, but it plays it quite straight right up until scenes like this. And then you go, okay, Guy Hamilton's directing this scene. And I don't remember there being as many camp scenes in Goldfinger. Watching that, maybe I'd have to go back to it. It still had elements, I think, but nowhere near to the degree of Diamonds Are Forever or this one when it goes off the deep end with a comedy.
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting distracted by that. The problem with the plane scene is that it's playing it for comic relief, and I think because we get so much of that in the Moore era with moments like that he's being a gentleman with it. There's a one-liner, and there's many one-liners, and even from the design of the other pilot with the massive goggles and all that, it's done for comedy, just weaving in between pages. I just don't think it's very interesting. I'm not going to lie, I'd completely forgotten about it until you brought it up, which probably explains the impact it had on me. And I think because I don't think it's as elongated as the other, I think because obviously soon after we get the boat scene, not too far after, it's again going for here's another over the top, and it distracts you from it. But the plane scene, yeah, it's not a great one. I think a lot of the other Bond films have done planes a lot better.
Yeah, I think, usually when you think of Bond films and we're saying about the best scenes, a lot of the time it is like the plane scene, whether it's like the Little Nelly or it's like all these other things that come up. But yeah, this film scene's completely forgettable. You don't need it in the film, and even having it in there, like you said, it's just played off the comic relief for just a few quick laughs and then move on. So
I think it's like Diamonds Are Forever in that regard, where you had two chase scenes pretty much almost back to back. You know, you had the moon rover scene, and then you had the muscle car chase scene, or it was vice versa. I can't remember which one came first. But they followed in very much quick succession, and that's kind of the same with this one. You have this whole car chase with like among the planes, and then not long after you have like an even longer chase scene with the boat. So pick one and just have one, and don't have it be 14 minutes. No action scene. Well, I'm not going to say that no action scene should be 14 minutes, but especially one on this scale. Shall we get on to the segment of all segments, the Bond one-liner of the week? There's a few of them, so I'm going to read out the ones that I've got. Just being disarming, darling, when he takes off the guy's arm at the end of the film on the train. That made me chuckle. He always did have an inflated opinion of himself. That was,
that one sticks out to me, yeah.
I once had a nasty turn in a booth. That was a good one, when he was in like the revolving door thing in the booth. But I think my favorite one is actually right at the beginning of the film when he uses the watch to unzip Caruso's dress. And he says, sheer magnetism, darling. That I was like, oh, here we are. Roger Moore's here to stay for the next few weeks. Here we go. So I do have a few more written down, but I don't know if you guys had any other one-liners or moments.
No, that's for me.
Just the inflated ego for me. That's the main one I come to.
Yeah.
It's just, I think, Sean Connery was the master of sort of, not necessarily delivering them, but Sean Connery, when he had a one-liner, it was a storming one. But Roger Moore is like a pick and mix, and one of them will work. It's just finding which one's going to work in which film, and I think you always know it when you hear it, and it's definitely that one for me.
No, I agree with you there. Like, a lot of them are hit and miss, but when they do deliver, he has very good comedic timing to be able to play them off. Possibly the best comedic timing out of all of the Bonds to come beforehand. Maybe that came from his experience on The Saint, which was a very similar kind of show to Bond. It was kind of, played off that comedic element. So, yeah.
Nikolai's chipped in with his one as well. I like a genuine Felix Leiter, illuminating. There's so many good ones in this one. I knew that the Moore ones were like just absolutely just fertile ground for all the one-liners. So I'm very much looking forward to next week's as well with Man with a Golden Gun to see what comes up in that one, because this is the best thing. I kind of don't remember any of the one-liners throughout the rest of these films. Nikolai also says, I also adore how when he first meets a laughing Teehee, he says, funny how he finds the least little thing amusing. Yeah, there's a lot of good sort of quips in there. I think that's just, it's part and parcel of Roger Moore, isn't it? Which I guess sort of takes us on to overall opinions on this film. And, when we first started this conversation almost, an hour and a half ago, bloody hell, this is going to be one of our longest ones. Would never have called that. I'd sort of started off with a very kind of unsure of myself what I think of this film. I appreciate the good elements. I think, as we mentioned, the villains are very strong in this one, the supporting villains especially. I do actually kind of like the blaxploitation tone of this film. It does feel very different. It does feel completely out of place in a Bond film, I'm not going to lie, but it does make it feel unique. It comes down to the soundtrack as well, the kind of funk guitar, and I guess I just like tropes and those kind of films. And there've been loads of other directors that have done sort of even Tarantino has done homages to those kind of films very much throughout of his films. So I really appreciated that. Got a soft spot for Roger Moore. Absolutely love Roger Moore's Bond. And I think this is a good first entry for him. Very much looking forward to the next few weeks of it. I think the things that hold it back are Mankiewicz's writing, which we mentioned last week, and the over-reliance on comic relief and the campy tone to elements of it. The Bond girls did let this one down quite a bit for me, so I think that's another point against it too. But other than that, I think it's not perfect and it's not as good as I remember it initially, but I think there's a lot to like with this one. I was entertained by it. I wasn't sort of rolling my eyes and just wishing it was over like Diamonds Are Forever last week and getting genuinely angry about that film. This one was fun. This was one that I would go back to this one. I would quite happily go back to this one.
Yeah, I'm in a situation, a weird one, where I don't really care for the story at all in this. I'm more watching this for the characters. I obviously like Roger Moore. I like the villain troupe. I like Solitaire and what they're able to do with it. But then it's always missing something. And I think, when you got people that, tell me what Bond films to watch, I do say this one because it's not just the first Roger Moore one, but this is by far, I think, with the blaxploitation stuff, it stands out the most. It's the most different. It's the most un-James Bondian of the Roger Moore era, I would say, and I think that's why it's worth a fascinating insight into. But there are certainly issues, but I think Roger Moore and Kananga as a villain, they're able to pull it through to make her interesting. And the main thing, it leaves you wanting more Roger Moore. They had to get away from the Connery era in all sense of it. They had to move on properly this time. They couldn't afford for this one to go wrong contextually, to then have to switch it up again in the future. So big decisions were made. They had a payoff, and this was able to then move on for the future film. So solid entry for Roger Moore in his first one, and it leaves on quite a streak for some that are going to come up soon.
For me, I'm very much down the middle of this one. I don't think it's in the kind of upper echelons of being one of the best Bond films. I don't think it's down in the depths of being one of the worst Bond films. It's a very middle of the road film. I think there are a lot of things that are wrong with it, but I also think that the moments in the films, like we talked about, are some of the most iconic, and the characters introduced are ones that stick with you for a very long time. And it is a good introduction to kind of the Bond universe for Roger Moore as a character who gets developed more and more as the films go on. So it's a solid base. However, there are still those elements creeping in, especially with the writing side of things towards certain American characters. I'm not harping on too much on that character in particular, but just in general, the writing did let this film down. And I say to the Bond, I still like Jane Seymour as a Bond girl. I think that she offered enough in the film to kind of contribute to that kind of role that was fulfilled. I do think that there are some elements of the film that are just let down in other areas. So middle of the road, very much kind of, it'll probably end up being middle of the pack.
Absolutely. It's a mixed bag from us on this one, but we want to hear from you guys as well. So, you've been commenting along the usual suspects in the comments tonight, which is always great. But if you are discovering this review after we've gone live, please do let us know your thoughts on Live and Let Die. Are there any scenes that we've got to mention, any characters that you wanted us to go into more detail? Let us know your opinions on this film, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, or whether you kind of like us, meet in the middle somewhere. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. And of course, we will be back next week at exactly the same time, 8 p.m., which is going to be an unmissable one. That's going to be Man with a Golden Gun. That's going to be Tuesday, the 15th of June at 8 p.m., as I mentioned. I'm very much looking forward to going back to that one, but that is going to be a very, very interesting conversation. So please do make sure that you come back for that one. Once again, big thank you to everyone that's been commenting along tonight. It's always great to engage with you and for you to kind of teach us some Bond facts that maybe we don't even know. And there's quite a few that maybe we don't know. So, we always appreciate you guys tuning in every week for that. But on top of Bond now, we will have another regular show week to week, which is going to be tomorrow. It's going to be our spoiler-filled discussion on Loki. Disney Plus is back with another Marvel show, and we're going to be here every single Wednesday, exactly the same time again, 8 p.m. GMT, or BST, sorry, for our spoiler discussion. We've already done our spoiler-free review on episodes 1 and 2 of Loki so far, so go and check that one out as a nice little introductory review into it. And then we're going to be chatting all things Marvel once again. It just never goes away, does it? It's always there. And then I'm going to hand over to George now for the other show that we've got coming up.
Yes, absolutely, guys. So this Sunday, episode 1 of the brand new series, Reboots from Hell, Pulp Fiction, is up first. We're rebooting the films that none of us want to see get rebooted. We're going to beat Hollywood to it. We have our own cast of actors we're picking for the roles. We're bringing our own director. That's going to be a new show. We're thinking maybe once a month, minimum one a month. But check that out. There's an introductory video introducing the subject, the topic, what we want to do, the whole purpose of it. Obviously, we don't have the money to actually reboot these things, and we don't want to even get rebooted. So it's a kind of satire, with bit of a joke, bit serious, bit of all of it. But the main thing is that it's something different, and I think it's going to be absolute carnage and truth. So do check that. That's going to be live this Sunday, the 13th, 8 p.m. as well. That's going to be a big one. And as you said, go watch that video and then let us know your thoughts on Pulp Fiction, because don't comment about Pulp Fiction on James Bond. I'm a bit OCD like that.
Absolutely. And of course, the best way to stay in contact with us is on our social medias as well, with all these other shows that are coming out, and obviously the hype up for each new James Bond review. If you're here just for the Bond reviews, follow us on Facebook at Cinema Savvy, Twitter at Cinema_Savvy, Letterboxd, which is going to be especially useful for Reboots from Hell coming this weekend. Just find us on there at Cinema Savvy. And also we've got the TeePublic link in the description down below, where you can pick up some t-shirt designs, including the very nice James Bond logo right there at the bottom of the screen. That'll do it from us tonight, in which was probably our longest one, actually, I think, which was very surprising for this one. Big thank you to everyone that's tuned in tonight, as always, and we'll see you guys on the next video. Take care, everyone.